She went at noon. That detail is not incidental. In the ancient Near East, women went to the well in the morning or in the cool of the evening when the heat had broken and the walking was bearable. They went together in groups because the well was a social gathering point, the place where news was exchanged and relationships maintained. The well was not just a source of water. It was the center of a village's social life. She went at noon, alone, in the full heat of the day when no one else would be there. That single detail tells you almost everything you need to know about this woman before she says a word. She was not avoiding the heat. She was avoiding people. Something in her life, something specific and known to everyone in her community, had made the ordinary morning routine at the well impossible for her. Whatever it was, it had pushed her to the margins of her own society, into the silence of the midday sun, where she could draw water without having to feel the weight of other people's awareness of who she was. She arrived at the well and found a man sitting there. He was Jewish. She could tell immediately the clothing, the manner, everything about him identified him as a Jew. And a Jew in Samaria was not an ordinary circumstance. Jews did not pass through Samaria if they could avoid it. The enmity between the two communities was centuries old, rooted in history and theology, and the particular bitterness that comes from people who were once close to each other, turning into people who regard each other with contempt. He spoke to her first. "Give me a drink." 2 words in the original Greek. A request so ordinary, so basic, that its ordinariness is itself the first extraordinary thing about this conversation. A Jewish man, alone, in Samaria, speaking to a Samaritan woman he had never met, breaking not 1 but 2 layers of social convention in a single sentence. She said, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" She had named both barriers simultaneously, his ethnicity, her gender. The combination of the two made the request not just unusual, but, by the standards of first-century Jewish culture, almost scandalous. And the conversation that followed, conducted at a well in the heat of a Samaritan noon, between a social outcast and a man his own disciples would be uncomfortable finding him with, is one of the longest, most complex, most theologically dense conversations recorded anywhere in the 4 Gospels. Jesus spoke to his own disciples in parables that they frequently misunderstood. He spoke to crowds in images that required interpretation. But here, at this well, with this woman who had every social and theological reason to be dismissed, he said things he had not yet said clearly to anyone else. This is that conversation. To understand what is happening at the well, you need to understand where the well is. Samaria, the territory that sits between Judea in the south and Galilee in the north. For a first-century Jew traveling from Jerusalem to Galilee, Samaria was the direct route, the route that shortened the journey by days. And yet most Jewish travelers did not take it. They crossed the Jordan, traveled north through Perea on the eastern side of the river, and crossed back, the longer road, the road that avoided Samaria entirely. The reason was history. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and deported most of its population. They replaced the deported Israelites with peoples from other parts of their empire, Babylonians, Arameans, and others who intermarried with the Israelites who had remained. The result, over generations, was a population that was ethnically mixed and religiously syncretic. They retained elements of Israelite faith. They accepted the Torah. They worshipped the God of Israel, but they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim rather than recognizing Jerusalem as the legitimate center of worship. Their version of the faith was, from the perspective of the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem, a corruption, a mixture, an illegitimate hybrid. For Jews, Samaritans were not simply foreigners. They were something worse, people who were almost right, who shared the same foundational texts, but had, in Jewish eyes, distorted everything. The contempt that fell on them had the particular edge that comes from partial similarity. It was not the distant incomprehension one might feel toward a completely different culture. It was the irritated dismissal one reserves for something that almost understands, but fundamentally misses the point. Samaritans returned the sentiment. Their own traditions maintained that it was Jerusalem, not Gerizim, that had corrupted the original faith. That the Jerusalem priesthood had distorted the worship of Yahweh and elevated human tradition above the divine command. That Mount Gerizim, not the Temple Mount, was the true holy mountain, the place where God had chosen his name to dwell. Into this centuries-old, theologically charged, ethnically freighted mutual contempt, John 4 places Jesus. He had to pass through Samaria, the text says. That phrase is interesting. The Greek word translated had to is sometimes translated it was necessary. Most Jewish travelers chose not to pass through Samaria. Jesus chose to. Or, more precisely, the text suggests that his route was not simply a matter of geographic convenience, but of divine necessity. He had an appointment to keep. He came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph, and Jacob's well was there. Jacob's well. The name is important. It reaches back to the patriarch himself, to the ancestor of the 12 tribes, to the man whose wrestling with God had given him the name Israel. The Samaritans claimed this heritage too. They were not, in their own self-understanding, outsiders to the covenant story. They were its guardians. Jesus, worn out by the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. His disciples had gone into the city to buy food. He was alone. The solitude is significant. When the disciples return later in the story, they are astonished to find him talking with a woman, but they say nothing. The text notes, apparently because they recognize that whatever is happening is beyond the ordinary categories of their understanding. His being alone means there are no witnesses to the early part of this conversation. What is recorded in John 4 is what Jesus chose to share, or what the woman herself later reported to her community. She came to draw water. He asked for a drink. Her question, "How is it that you ask me?" is not hostile. It reads more like genuine puzzlement. She is used to being avoided, not addressed. And the person addressing her is a Jew, which adds another layer of improbability to the situation. Jesus' response does something that will characterize the entire conversation. He shifts the frame entirely. She has asked a question about social convention. "Why are you talking to me?" And he answers with something that makes her question seem suddenly very small. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, "Give me a drink," you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Two things are happening in that sentence simultaneously. The first is an invitation. He is telling her that she is talking to someone whose identity, if she knew it, would completely reorient the conversation. The one asking for water is also the one who has something she needs, not the other way around. The second thing is a phrase that carries more weight than it first appears: living water. In Hebrew and Aramaic, living water was a technical term for running water, water from a spring or a river, as opposed to stored water in a cistern. Living water was considered superior, purer, more desirable. It was the kind of water used in ritual purification. When she hears the phrase, she understands it in this ordinary sense first. She points out the obvious. He has no bucket. The well is deep. Where is he going to get this living water? Is he greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? The question is not purely rhetorical. She is asking, in the idiom of her tradition, about authority. Jacob is not a distant figure to a Samaritan woman. He is a founding ancestor, the one from whose hands this very well came. To claim access to something greater than what Jacob provided is to claim a very significant kind of authority. She is testing the claim, not mocking it. And Jesus does not back away from the comparison. He accepts it and raises it. Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. He has just told her that what he offers is not merely better water, or cleaner water, or more conveniently located water. He has told her that he offers something that addresses the underlying condition of human thirst permanently, not a superior resource that still runs out. A spring, a source that reproduces itself from the inside. The word he uses for spring is significant. In the Greek, it is the word for a fountain or a well that produces its own water, as opposed to a cistern that stores what falls into it. What he is offering is not stored grace to be drawn on until it runs out. It is a generative, self-sustaining presence, something that wells up from within, perpetually, toward eternal life. She said, "Sir, give me this water, so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Her response is typically read as a misunderstanding, as though she is still thinking in purely literal terms. And there is some literal thinking in it. She is still processing the image at its surface level. But there is something else in it too. She is asking for what he is offering. Even if she does not fully understand it, even if she is still partly speaking about physical water, she has said yes to the invitation. Give me this. That moment, give me this, is the hinge of the entire conversation. What Jesus says next is one of the most abrupt conversational shifts in the Gospels. Go, call your husband, and come here. She had just asked for living water. He responds by asking her to bring her husband. The shift is so sudden, so apparently unrelated to what came before, that it demands explanation. She said, "I have no husband." Jesus said, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." The weight of those sentences has been debated for 2,000 years, and that debate is itself revealing. It tells us something about how uncomfortable the text makes us, and why. The first instinct of many readers is to interpret the 5 husbands as a moral indictment, 5 failed marriages, or 5 relationships outside of marriage, and now a 6th man who is not even a husband. The woman, on this reading, is a serial adulteress, or a morally compromised figure whose life of sexual sin is being exposed by Jesus in this moment. That reading has dominated popular treatments of this story. The woman becomes, in this interpretation, a symbol of moral failure, who is graciously received by Jesus despite her sinfulness. And while the grace Jesus shows her is real and important, this reading misses several things that the text is actually doing. First, a technical point about the ancient world. In first-century Judea and Samaria, divorce was almost exclusively a male privilege. A woman could not initiate divorce. She could be divorced. The 5 marriages this woman had been through were not necessarily the result of her own choices or her own moral failures. She could have been divorced by 5 husbands for reasons entirely outside her control. She could have been widowed multiple times. The text does not say she committed adultery. It says she had 5 husbands. Those are not the same thing. Second, and more importantly, the social consequences of multiple marriages, however they came about, would have been devastating for a woman in her community. Each divorce or death would have reduced her status further. By the end of 5 husbands, she would have been seen as cursed, or as bad luck, or as morally suspect, regardless of the actual causes. And the man she is currently with, who has not made her his wife, she is in the most vulnerable position possible. She has no legal standing, no security, no protection. She is entirely dependent on the goodwill of a man who has not committed himself to her. She is not a sinner being caught out. She is a woman whose life has been defined by a series of relationships, most of them probably not chosen freely, all of them bearing the weight of social stigma that have left her utterly alone. And Jesus names all of it, not to condemn it, not to lecture her, but to demonstrate that he knows, he sees her, all of her. Not the public version, not the managed presentation that any of us make when we encounter a stranger, the full version, the one she has been hiding from by coming to the well at noon. What you have said is true. Those 5 words are arguably the most important words in the entire conversation. He does not say, "You are a sinner." He does not say, "Your life is wrong." He says, "What you have said is true." He confirms her own honest statement, "I have no husband," rather than correcting it or condemning it. He sees her. He knows her history. And his response is not judgment, it is recognition. She had been hiding at the well. He found her there, and looked directly at her, and saw everything. And the look was not contempt. It was something she had probably never received from anyone in her community. She called him a prophet. Her response to being seen, to having her history named without condemnation, is itself remarkable. She does not run. She does not deflect with embarrassment or anger. She engages. She pushes into the conversation. And what she pushes into is the oldest argument between her people and his. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. The mountain she is gesturing toward is Mount Gerizim, visible from where they are standing. The central theological dispute between Samaritans and Jews, the dispute that had defined the enmity between them for centuries, was not about whether to worship Yahweh. Both communities worshipped Yahweh. The dispute was about where, Jerusalem or Gerizim, the temple or the mountain. The Davidic Solomonic establishment, or the older tradition of Moses and Joshua. She is asking him to adjudicate the oldest argument she knows. And Jesus' response is one of the most radical theological statements in the entire Gospel of John. Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Unpack this slowly, because almost every sentence is explosive. He starts with an acknowledgement that will become a refusal of the premise. The hour is coming when neither mountain will be the right answer. He is not picking a side in the Jerusalem-Gerizim debate. He is announcing that the entire framework of the debate is about to become obsolete. The question of where to worship is being replaced by a different question: how? He does something striking in the middle of his response. He sides, clearly and without apology, with Jewish tradition on the historical question: salvation is from the Jews. He does not erase the distinction between Samaritan and Jewish understanding. He acknowledges it. The Jews have known something the Samaritans have not fully known. The covenant, the prophets, the scriptures through which salvation has come belong to the Jewish tradition. He is not being diplomatically vague. He is being historically honest. But then he immediately transcends the distinction he has just drawn, because the hour that is coming, the hour that is, in fact, already present, makes the question of Jerusalem versus Gerizim irrelevant. True worshippers will worship in spirit and truth, not in a location, not in a building, not according to the rituals that attach worship to a specific place, in spirit and truth. By invoking spirit and truth, Jesus effectively dismantles the machinery of religious gatekeeping. He tells her that God is not a destination to be reached through the right mountain or the correct temple ritual. Instead, worship is a matter of alignment, an internal honesty where the human spirit meets the divine presence. Most remarkably, he describes a Father who is seeking. This is not a God waiting to be found by those who perform the best. This is a God on a search and rescue mission, finding a weary woman at a dusty well in the middle of a Samaritan afternoon. She said, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." This is the deepest thing she has said in the entire conversation. Beneath all the social awkwardness, beneath the theological argument about mountains, beneath the deflection to doctrine, when his knowledge of her life became too intimate, there was this: a hope, a genuine expectation, a belief that someone was coming who would make everything clear, who would explain all the things that the centuries of argument had left unresolved. The Samaritan tradition had its own messianic expectation, a figure called the Taheb, the restorer, who would come and reveal all truth. She was not a theologically shallow person. She was a person who had thought about these things, who carried hope underneath her circumstances. This was the moment the entire conversation had been building toward. She was looking for a future solution. a distant figure to fix the world's problems. But Jesus was about to collapse the distance between prophecy and the present moment. And Jesus said, "I who speak to you am He." In the Greek, the declaration is more stark than English translations typically convey. He says, literally, "I am the one speaking to you." I am, ego eimi, the same words that God used from the burning bush when Moses asked for his name. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures that Jesus and his contemporaries used, the divine name rendered in Exodus 3 is ego eimi. I am who I am. I am. Jesus uses this phrase repeatedly in the Gospel of John, and scholars have long recognized that the repetition is not accidental. When he says, "Before Abraham was, I am," the crowd picks up stones because they understand what he is claiming. When he says, "I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the resurrection and the life," the phrase carries the freight of the divine name. Here, at the well, to this woman who has been pushed to the margins of her society, not to the Pharisees, not to the Jewish authorities, not to the crowds in Jerusalem, he says, for one of the first times in the Gospel, "I am." He does not say, "I will tell you all things," as she had expected the Messiah to do. He says, "I am." The revealer and the revelation are the same person. She had been waiting for someone who would explain everything. And what arrives is not an explanation, but a presence that is, in itself, the answer to every question she has carried. At that moment, his disciples returned. The text notes their surprise. They marveled that he was talking with a woman. The word for marveled is the same word used elsewhere for astonishment at something genuinely unexpected. They did not say anything to him about it. But the text records that they were thinking about it. No one asked him why he was talking with her, or what he was seeking. Perhaps the conversation they had overheard made the question seem inadequate, and the woman left her water jar. This is one of the most striking physical details in the entire passage. She had come to the well for water. She had drawn it, or was about to draw it, and now she leaves her jar, the reason she came, the thing she needed, the thing that had shaped her entire noon routine, and goes back into the city. She had come to avoid people. She left to find them. "Come, see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" She is doing something very specific with those words. She is not giving a theological lecture. She is not explaining the living water or the worship in spirit and truth. She is giving her personal testimony. "He told me everything I ever did," and attaching it to a question rather than a claim. Can this be the Christ? She is not proclaiming with certainty. She is inviting people to come and see for themselves. She is creating the conditions for an encounter rather than reporting the conclusions of one. This is actually a very sophisticated evangelistic move, though it probably did not feel like strategy to her. It feels like the instinct of someone who has just been found and cannot think of anything more urgent than bringing others to the same place. The people of the city went out and came to Jesus. And then Jesus says something to his disciples that needs to be read alongside the whole scene. "Do you not say, 'There are yet 4 months? Then comes the harvest?' Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest." He is looking at the Samaritans coming toward him across the fields and calling them a harvest. The disciples, who had just returned from buying food in the Samaritan city, had presumably seen these same people, and it had not occurred to them to think of them as a harvest. It had not occurred to them that this was the reason he had to pass through Samaria. The woman, going back to the city she had been avoiding, was doing the work his disciples had not thought to do when they were in the city themselves. John 4 is a passage that has been read primarily as a story about personal evangelism, or about Jesus' acceptance of social outcasts, or about the nature of worship. All of those readings are legitimate, but there is a deeper structure to the conversation that deserves attention. The conversation moves through a series of escalating identifications. She calls him a Jew at the beginning, placing him in an ethnic and religious category. He responds by pointing to something that transcends that category. She calls him Sir, a polite but distant title. He keeps pushing. She calls him a prophet, acknowledging spiritual authority but keeping him in a familiar category. He keeps pushing. She invokes the Messiah, the ultimate category she has, the figure who would resolve all ambiguity. And he says, I am he. But then the conversation has a consequence that goes beyond the woman herself. The Samaritans who come out to see him ask him to stay. He stays 2 days. And at the end of those 2 days, the text records their conclusion. We know that this is indeed the Savior of the world. Not the Savior of the Jews, not the Messiah for whom Israel was waiting, the Savior of the world. The Samaritans, the people who were neither fully Jewish nor fully Gentile, who occupied the ambiguous middle space between the covenant community and the wider world, are the first people in the Gospel of John to use this phrase. The first people to articulate what Jesus' significance is for the whole of humanity, not just for one ethnic or religious group. This is not accidental. The Samaritans, positioned at the boundary between Jew and Gentile, between inside and outside the covenant, speak the word that most fully captures what is happening. They are the hinge on which the story turns from a story about one people to a story about all people. And it began with a woman who came to the well at noon to avoid everyone. We need to return to the 5 husbands, because there is something in that exchange that has not yet been fully examined. When Jesus names her history 5 husbands, and the man she is with now is not her husband, the exchange is often read primarily as a demonstration of his supernatural knowledge. He knows what he should not know. This is the sign of a prophet. But there is more happening in that moment. Consider what Jesus does not say. He does not say, you need to repent of your history. He does not say, you need to leave the man you are with. He does not follow the naming of her situation with any instruction about how she needs to change it. He names it, she confirms it, he says, you spoke truly, and then the conversation moves to theology. The naming of her life is not a precondition for receiving what he has to offer. It is not a barrier she has to clear before she can access the living water. It is simply an acknowledgement of reality, the full reality of who she is and what she has been through. He sees it. She does not have to hide it. This is, in fact, the pattern throughout the Gospels of how Jesus relates to people whose lives are complicated. He does not require people to have their lives sorted out before they can encounter him. He does not impose conditions of moral cleanliness before making his presence available. He sits by the well. He asks for water. He offers something better. He sees everything. He says, what you said is true. And the conversation continues. The woman at the well does not become a disciple in the formal sense. She is not called to leave her work and follow him the way Peter and Andrew were called. She goes back to her city with a question, can this be the Christ? And invites her community to come and see. Her encounter with Jesus changes her relationship with the community she had been hiding from before it changes anything else about her circumstances. She came to the well alone, and she returned to the city with something to say. The living water that wells up to eternal life, the spring that Jesus said would form in her, appears to begin working immediately. Not in the direction of personal moral transformation that requires years of discipline, in the direction of relationship, of community, of going back to the people she had been avoiding and saying, come and see. The title of this video asks what Jesus actually said that changed everything. We have followed the conversation closely enough now to answer that question. He said several things that were extraordinary. The offer of living water, the statement about worship in spirit and truth, the declaration, I am. All of these are, in different ways, revolutionary. But the thing that changed everything, the thing that initiated all of it, was a request. Give me a drink. He asked her for something. He placed himself in a position of need in relation to her. He made himself vulnerable to her response, which could have been refusal. He crossed every social barrier that his culture had erected between them. Jewish, Samaritan, male, female, respectable, stigmatized, and approached her as a person from whom he wanted something. This is not a small thing. The power dynamics of first-century Palestine were not subtle. A Jewish man asking anything of a Samaritan woman was inverting a hierarchy so completely that her response, "How is it that you ask me?" was entirely reasonable. The surprise was genuine. Nobody in her experience had placed themselves in this kind of need relationship with her. And from that inversion, from his willingness to be the one asking rather than the one dispensing, everything else followed. The conversation could happen because the posture was right. He was not approaching her as a superior, addressing an inferior. He was approaching her as one human being to another, thirsty by a well, in need of what she could provide. The living water, the worship in spirit and truth, the declaration of identity, all of it was delivered from the position of "give me a drink," from the posture of the one who needs something, from the person he is about to transform. This is deeply consistent with the pattern that the Gospel of John traces throughout the ministry of Jesus. He consistently places himself in positions of apparent need or vulnerability that become the occasion for something profound. At the wedding in Cana, he needs his mother to point out the problem. At the tomb of Lazarus, he asks where they have laid him. On the cross, he says, "I am thirsty." The one who offers living water is thirsty on the cross. The one who is the light of the world is laid in darkness. The posture of need is not weakness. It is the method of entry into every genuine encounter. The title promised a question that 2,000 years have not fully answered. Here it is. When Jesus says God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth, and when he says the Father is seeking such people to worship him, he is making a claim about what God wants from human beings that is both clarifying and inexhaustibly. Clarifying because it dissolves the institutional question entirely. The debate about Jerusalem versus Gerizim, temple versus mountain, Orthodox versus Reformed versus Catholic versus evangelical. All of these are, at some level, the same argument she was raising at the well. Which is the right place? Which is the right form? Which external structure correctly contains the thing that matters? And the answer he gave is not a refusal to answer. It is an answer that relocates the question. The right external form is the one that genuinely expresses an internal reality of spirit and truth. The wrong external form is the one that substitutes for that reality, or that uses the forms to avoid the encounter with God that the forms are supposed to facilitate. But inexhaustible because the question of what it actually means to worship in spirit and truth, how to know whether what one is doing is the real thing or a sophisticated substitute, is not a question that has a simple, institutional answer. It cannot be answered by pointing to the right denomination or the right liturgy or the right worship style. It is a question that has to be answered continuously by the individual human being who is trying to be genuinely present to the God who is genuinely seeking. The woman at the well is a type of figure for every person who has been shaped by a version of religion that did not quite reach them, who carries genuine hope beneath damaged circumstances, who goes to the well at noon to avoid the weight of being known, and who discovers there a presence that already knows everything and has come looking anyway. She was asking the right questions. The argument about the mountain was not merely deflection, it was the theological question she actually cared about. Where is God? Where is the right place to find him? And Jesus' answer was, the hour has already come when that question is answered not by geography, but by the quality of the encounter. He is a spirit. He is seeking. He has come to this well in the heat of noon and asked for a drink. The question she raised is the question the church has been arguing about since the first century. The answer he gave is the one that keeps proving bigger than any particular answer the church has settled on. Worship in spirit and truth. Not this mountain, not Jerusalem, here, in the actual encounter with the one who knows everything you have ever done and says, what you have said is true. The woman disappears from the Gospel of John after chapter 4. She is not mentioned again. We do not know what happened to her. We do not know whether she continued to live with the man who was not her husband, or whether she eventually found the stability of a recognized relationship, or whether she left Sychar entirely. We do not know whether the Samaritan community that came to faith in those 2 days continued as a community, or what happened to them when the later mission to Samaria described in Acts 8 arrived. The silence after the encounter is, in its own way, consistent with the theology of the encounter itself. Jesus did not give her a program. He did not tell her what to do next. He gave her living water and left her with a question: can this be the Christ? Which she gave back to her community. What they did with it was theirs. There is a tradition in some Eastern Orthodox churches that identifies the woman at the well with a saint named Fotini, the Luminous One. According to this tradition, she became an active evangelist, traveling eventually to Rome and being martyred under Nero. The tradition gives her name, she is unnamed in the Gospel of John, gives her a family, 5 sisters and 2 sons, and gives her an end worthy of the beginning. Whether this tradition has historical basis is impossible to verify, but the impulse behind it, the sense that what happened at the well could not have ended with a return to ordinary life, is true to the internal logic of the story. She left her water jar. She went back to the people she had been avoiding. She said, "Come and see." That is not the behavior of a person who went back to the same life she had been living. That is the behavior of a person who found, at the well, something that reorganized everything. 2,000 years after the conversation at the well, the questions it raises remain alive. The question about worship in spirit and truth versus in the right place with the right forms is not a question that Christianity has settled. Every generation rediscovers the tension between the external structures that provide continuity and the internal reality that the structures are supposed to serve. Every generation produces people who have the forms without the reality, and people who have the reality without the forms, and people who are genuinely trying to hold both together. The question about who is included, whether the woman at the well, the Samaritans, the people who are 1 degree outside the official community, belong to the story, is not a question that any institution has fully answered. The history of Christianity is, in part, a history of drawing boundaries and then having those boundaries challenged by encounters that look like the one at the well. Someone unexpected being offered something they were not supposed to be offered. Someone asking, "How is it that you speak to me?" And the question about encounter, about what it means to meet the God who is seeking, at the well where you did not expect to find him, in the circumstances you did not choose, is the question that everyone who has ever had a genuine religious experience knows is real, and that everyone who has never had one cannot quite grasp from the outside. She went at noon to avoid being known. He was already there. He asked for water. She gave him what he asked for, and received something she could not have asked for because she had not known it existed. That structure, the seeking God who approaches through apparent need, the encounter that begins with the ordinary and moves through recognition to revelation, is not unique to this woman. It is the shape of the encounter the Gospel of John is describing throughout, the light that came into the world, the Word that became flesh and dwelt among us. The God who is Spirit, seeking worshipers, coming to the well at noon and saying, "Give me a drink." The question is, what you do when you look up from the water jar and find him there. The woman at the well reminds us that we are never too far on the margins to be found. If this exploration of being truly seen and known has resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their history is not a barrier to God's grace. To join us as we continue to dive into these life-changing encounters in the Gospels, make sure to subscribe. We go deep here because the truth is always deeper than the surface. Thank you for watching, and remember, the Father is still seeking, and the well is never truly empty.